Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, it is my great honor to bring you Senate Bill 2A, which comes to you from the House Committee on Elections, Ethics, and Rules. It is the basic nature of our system of politics and government that complex concepts often are reduced to very simple propositions. And in the case of Senate Bill 2, it seems that the opposite is occurring. In a moment, I'll try to provide a brief overview of the provisions of this 21-page bill. Colleagues, I doubt that you'll be surprised to find a great deal of detail and nuance there. But this complex piece of legislation is born of one of the most profoundly simple and straightforward notions that we have ever encountered. If you are an American, you have the same rights and responsibilities as every other American. Senate Bill 2 came from the Elections Committee, but it is also brought to you by people who share the belief that we as elected officials are bound by honor and duty to reflect that principle in the way we do our jobs. In broad terms, Senate Bill 2 establishes that a person cannot be refused employment, fired from a job, denied rental housing, or denied service in a restaurant because of his or her sexual orientation. These protections extend to every sexual orientation, which of course includes heterosexuals. Here are some of the specific anti-discrimination statutes that are amended by Senate Bill 2A. Employment. Senate Bill 2 would make it illegal for an employer, labor union, or employment agency to refuse to hire or discharge an individual or to discriminate against an individual in the compensation, terms, or conditions of employment on the basis of sexual orientation. The bill explicitly allows employers to enforce valid dress codes and policies with reasonable accommodations to the health and safety of employees. In the area of housing, Senate Bill 2 would outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation in housing, specifically in the following areas: sale, lease, or rental of real property, expulsion of a purchaser from rental property, restrictions or distinctions in the terms, conditions, or privileges relating to the sale, rental, lease, or occupancy of real property. In public accommodation, the bill would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation in public accommodations like stores, hotels, and restaurants. In public services, Senate Bill 2 would prohibit the state from discriminating against an individual based on sexual orientation when the individual is being considered for admission to state programs and services. For example, the state could not decide that someone is unable to live in the state mental hospital because of that person's sexual orientation. In education, Senate Bill 2 prohibits the state from discriminating against students based on sexual orientation when considering their admission to public schools and universities. The bill also prohibits a public charter school from refusing to admit a student because of sexual orientation. In policy terms, the bulk of Senate Bill 2 is really a series of amendments to existing statutes. But as we can attest, this is far from being a simple bill. Of all the questions before this body, there may well be none more controversial than that of whether we should extend basic rights and protections to all Oregonians. It is to the credit of this institution that today we come together on behalf of our respective communities to address this very emotional issue in the earnest spirit of deliberation and respect. But this issue is contentious for a reason. Sometimes different values, different valid, equal, legitimate values come into conflict. We can't get around that. We may not always like it, but as legislators, it is our job to mediate that conflict. And on some level, that means compromise. And toward that end, a broad religious exemption was included in Senate Bill 2A. Many people feel that all discrimination is 100% wrong and should not be tolerated. On the other hand, many people feel that any restriction on the prerogatives of a religious institution is inappropriate. In attempting to balance those concerns, we turn to the language behind another religious exemption in existing law, the exemption that allows churches and other religious organizations to discriminate based on religion. There are already strong protections of religious freedom enshrined in the federal and state constitution, but the language of the religious exemption included in Senate Bill 2 goes even further. During the committee process in the House, this exemption was amended once again to add even more language assuring Oregon churches that their right to exercise their religion will not be hampered by Senate Bill 2. The end result is a religious exemption that not only is broader and stronger than that included in Senate Bill 1000 from the 2005 session, but that is in fact the broadest religious exemption of any sort set in Oregon law. Colleagues, I'm proud to have presided over the hearings on Senate Bill 2. We had a very open and deliberative committee process. We spent over 4 hours, in fact 4.5 hours, listening to public testimony, as well as hours of invited testimony. We invited advocates on both sides to present their positions to the committee, and we heard from people who had lost their jobs, lost their housing, and lost their families as a result of the kind of discrimination which we today stand at the precipice of forbidding. My colleague from Lake Oswego will go into more depth on the legal meaning of this bill. For now, I want to close by returning to a point I made earlier, that after we unpack the extensive legal and political baggage accompanying this debate, we really are left with just 3 simple questions. Are all Oregonians free from discrimination? Do all Oregonians deserve to be free from discrimination? And finally, do we have the courage to continue to deny that freedom, or do we have the courage to correct that injustice? Colleagues, I'm proud to join with Oregon political and business leaders, members of the faith community, and thousands of deserving Oregon families in asking for your aye vote on Senate Bill 2A.